we are in the same situation more or less with all Western countries. Of course, you can look to Zimbabwe, but the mainstream always has an excuse not to compare Zimbabwe to the US.
But Germany in 1920 was one of the world's great powers, was one of the most advanced countries on the face of the earth, had one of the highest standards of living at that time among all countries of the world, yet its currency collapsed. If it can happen to Germany in the 1920s, why can't it happen to America today?
As I said, it can happen everywhere, but I think if you really do want to do that comparison, there are differences because, I mean, the German situation in 1923, when basically the hyperinflation happened, was pretty different. At first view, at first glance, it was different because Germany, of course, had lost the First World War. There was the Contract of Versailles, which imposed really harsh conditions on Germany, and the only way basically to pay these back, we're talking about, I think, if you recalculate the demands the Allies imposed on Germany after World War I, it comes down to some 60 to 90,000 tons of gold, which was more or less at the time, all gold that was ever mined throughout history. So it was impossible to pay this back, not with gold, of course, which Germany did have in 1918 anyway, but it would have been almost impossible to pay it back in decades. So this is the German situation at the time. Today in the US, of course, you haven't lost the war. Basically, the US has won almost every war throughout history since its own, citizen war between the North and the South in the 1900s. No, sorry, in the 1860s. Yeah. Well, on the one hand, you have never lost the war. On the other hand, the US lives above its mean, and you can calculate that pretty easily by approximately $5 billion per day. This is the non-backed, let's do the calculation. The US these days has will go into debt in 2011 by at least $1.8 trillion dollars this year, and this is the official number. Mm-hmm. In one of my blogs at goldseitenblog.com, I had already predicted that number a year ago, when the official number was still, I think, 1.4 trillion, which there's quite some difference. And I believe we will end probably in 2011 close to 2 trillion. Which is more than double than was admitted a year ago. And
just to go, let me just interrupt for a sec, because I want to go back to the parallels to the Weimar Republic.
I'm coming to that.
Yeah, because the debt was imposed on Germany. The debt in the U.S. is self-imposed, but the external debts were there in both countries. So isn't that the similarity?
If you put it like this, and I would have come to that, yes, I would agree. There is the similarity. The U.S. infrastructure is not well destroyed, but admittedly, the German infrastructure was not really destroyed after World War I because the war never came to Germany's borders. So yes, you can compare that, and. Well, $5 billion a day, and only half, not even half of those $1.8 trillion per year, which I just mentioned, are backed by, tax income. So you could really say, and I'm serious here, that the US lives about 100% above their means. Were they forced to pay for their standard of living, and especially for their national state expenses by taxes only, they would have to save $1.5 trillion somewhere.
So just like...
No, 1 trillion, sorry.
Yeah. So just like the Reichsbank in the early 1920s kept printing Reichsmark currency because the debt could never be repaid, the U.S. is in a similar situation. The debt can never be repaid. I think the Federal Reserve probably recognizes that, and they're doing the same thing that the Reichsbank did. And I've actually written a number of times about the similarities between Mr. Bernanke and Rudolf Havenstein, who was the governor of the Reichsbank at the time. They both were following conventional wisdom. They both were printing currency because they were afraid to stop printing because of the implications, what it might do to the economy. Using this as an example, is the dollar going to go the same way as the Reichsmark?
The hyperinflation story had a, I would say, you could say it has had a 10-year prelude before 1923, but basically the story started in 1918 after the Lost War, and then came Versailles, and it took, and already in 1920 or 1921 you could feel the first, you could see the first signs of inflation. And this is really comparable, I think, to today's situation. If we had no statistical, well, easing and statistical fog over the real inflation numbers, then we would probably be already at 6 or 8%, maybe even higher, depending on what market you look at, per year nowadays. And this is more or less the situation in Germany in 1920, 21 maybe. And relentlessly, the numbers went up, and they really went exponentially, even parabolic, as of summer of 1923. That's about how long it took. And it was unsustainable. Everybody could see it. It was nobody could deny it. I would say, as of the end of 1922, and people reacted. They disposed of their earnings and their salaries as quickly as possible. At the very end, they spent it. The workers in the factories got paid, I think, daily. Maybe at the very end, they got paid twice daily, and their wives, they waited at the factory doors and spent the money as quickly as possible. And of course, this is not sustainable. Everybody knew. I think in 1922, maybe early 23, and after another 6 months in mid-November of 1923, it was over. It was unsustainable. It's a story in itself how the hyperinflation was ended then. It was more or less a psychological trick, but by November 2003, people were ready to accept everything as money if it had at least the promise of some backing. Mm-hmm. It was not gold at the time, but some other trick the government pulled out. Mm-hmm.